because the specific politics of the day are incidental. This is an energetic cycle that happens in humans and has been for time immemorial. So you're just caught up in a cycle. You're just caught up in something that humans do and have been doing and have been doing for a long time. I mean, as far back as hitting the other guy on the head with a cudgel because he said something you didn't like, right? Or he's trying to take your stuff or whatever. Like, this is ancient. And so being reactionary is very ancient.
Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So, Antonia, we've been podcasting about personality types for a hot minute, for a while now.
It has definitely been a minute.
For a few years. Since 2014 is when we started this show. We've been doing it every week since. And I've seen a lot of changes in the world since we started Personality Hacker and doing this podcast. Like, a lot of changes.
I've seen a lot of changes in the last 6 months.
Seen a lot of changes the last week, time of this recording. So there's been just upheaval of change. But I would say there's been, there's like the changes that just happen naturally, like life circumstance changes. But then there's like attunement changes, things that people are attuned to, or things that they, like the culture shifts, the fads and the culture and the things that people are interested in shifts. And I've noticed since we started doing this, a massive interest in personality types. That's one of the big changes I've noticed. I mean, just writ large, when we first started, very few people knew what cognitive functions were. And so in the early days, we were doing a lot of work on just helping people understand to take their 4 letters, the 4-letter code they have. Like, for example, I'm an ENFP, and find out the cognitive functions that help me, that basically point to how I perceive my world and how I make judgment or decisions in that world. That was a huge thing that's happened in the last 10 years. The other thing I think that's happened in the last 10 years or 12 years, however long it's been since we started this, has been this interest in shadow work. I think when it comes to personality types, but also in like other personal growth arenas, I see the shadow and shadow work coming to the forefront a lot for people, whether they're talking about Jungian concepts or personality concepts like we talk about. Shadow as a topic is in the public consciousness. I think it ties to people's perception of maybe challenging disorders or things. I think it's associated with things like narcissism and maybe sociopathy or things like this. I think people typically kind of, and not that I'm defining it that way, I'm just think that's that's the area people seem to clump all this together in.
Yeah, well, I think almost everybody, myself included, have become armchair psychologists.
Yeah,
and we've gotten really interested in.
We need arms on these chairs.
Yeah. Well, I'm using the back as an arm.
I'm just an armchair. You have like a French cigarette in it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'm not technically a psychologist, but I'm super fascinated by all of these concepts.
Yeah.
And so mental health has become very interesting. And I think in part because, it's not uncommon for us to have taken a psychology course in college or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's an area that has, psychology used to be a field that was very specialized and actually a little, suspicious.
Yeah.
Maybe even maligned.
Yeah.
But it's not that way anymore. It's become more of the, the zeitgeist.
Well,
and so
it was the online dating of the 1950s, right?
Right, exactly.
It was like, you met her online? Like, we were teenagers. That was like what? That's weird. Now, if you meet somebody in real space, that's the weird thing.
Yeah. Or you went to a therapist, you must be pretty messed up.
Yeah, that's how it used to be.
And now it's like, I go to my therapist for mental hygiene.
Yeah.
So
if you don't have a therapist, that's the thing.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think, I believe that that's all positive. I think it's all very good that we have become more and more open to just basic psychology being part of our lexicon. I think, though, that because of our interest in psychology and that most people have taken at least one psychology course in college, the way that it's taught tends to lean towards abnormal psychology.
Yeah.
And so we've gotten very interested because we've been taught to be interested in psychology in terms of mental health problems or disorders or abnormal psychology. It's very rare if you have like a course on happiness or on, general, emotional and psychological hygiene. And so because of that, I think that we have become fascinated by disordered behavior. And then I think that ends up down that road of into shadow work, because I think we We instinctively know that there is a connection between shadow work and disordered behavior, but we don't always necessarily know the direct line. We just know that there's probably something there. And so people get very fascinated by shadow work as part of, it's just kind of a thing in the zeitgeist right now.
Yeah. And so we're close to it. So we notice both of those things writ large, right? We notice when society and culture starts to take note of personality types and embody them and really be interested in them. And we've also noticed that shadow work has come on because that's what we deal with. But you listening or watching right now, you might stumble upon this episode and be like, I didn't really notice that as much as you guys are reporting. But here's the final third change I've seen since we started this show that I think nearly 100% of people watching or listening right now would agree with me on, that they have noticed a shift. And this is that everything has become political. And not just political in our country, but I think political on a global scale in all sorts of countries and places in the world. I think was already starting the rumblings of this for a while. And then when the global pandemic and lockdowns hit in 2020, I think people were stuck at home and they turned on their social media and their televisions and attuned to all of this. And they were like, what in the world? And I think anybody that wasn't political by that point not became political, but you couldn't escape it. It was everywhere. It was in your face. It's still is at the time of this recording. It seems to eat everything, eat the world. And it seems to be so ubiquitous and there's no way to escape it. There's no way to hide from it. We've tried to do our best here on this show, being apolitical, not talking about any specific topic that could be mapped to a political party or persuasion because we have a global audience. We don't just have people from the United States listening. And we think that the politics of the day they come and go. They're fads. I mean, what people were interested or politically motivated for in the 1930s are very different than they are in the 2020s.
Yeah.
And so these things shift. So we go, well, what's the thing that never changes? Those are principles, human principles of how humans work, how societies work, how groups work, and how individuals work. And if we focus on the principles, we believe, our theory is that no matter what the political wind of the day is, humans can navigate through it.
Yeah.
But if you look at these three things, personality type, shadow, and politics, there is a relationship between all of these. And if you look at the political world maybe as the stage where the performance happens, well, what's going on behind stage? The individuals of the personality types maybe on the stage playing. I'm giving this loose metaphor here. And they are contending with their shadows. And then when they step on stage, what's happening? And I think that's what we want to talk about today is unpack some of the concepts here, the Jungian concepts behind why maybe everything's become so political and why we feel more divided than ever and why people are taking sides and seem to be, what I would see, bringing their dirty laundry out into the public square for each other and themselves. And I think it's everywhere.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we should tune ourselves to today.
Yeah. And we made a decision a long time ago to be apolitical. And actually, it's caused people to believe that we've taken specific sides, even though we haven't. There have been time periods where like in the zeitgeist, things were insistently political. And the fact that we refused to become political in those moments seemed like we were making some sort of political statement.
Yeah.
And really, that's just because it's not aligned with our dharma. Like and actually, I think this episode will explain why, even though we're not presenting this material to explain our position. I think just the content itself will explain why we have been so apolitical.
Yeah.
And it's very easy for me to be apolitical. I grew up that way. I was in a very apolitical house that felt like politics detracted from their dharma. And so it's easy for me to do that, to just withhold my opinion. But I mean, when I was a kid, I didn't have any political opinions, and I do now, right? And in part because I can. It's not taken from me through any paradigm like it was when I was younger.
Yeah.
I was taught to not think in terms of politics at all and to not get involved in any sort of, anything that would refer to any government system or anything.
Yeah.
But now that I'm an adult and I'm not under that thinking anymore, I have created some, opinions.
Yeah.
But that said, it's not my mess, so it's not my message. And at the same time, I feel like I am influencing politics in a very microscopic way, because our dharma, or my dharma, and I won't speak for you, but my dharma is to help people do integration work and to, like bring in their disowned parts, right? Integrate into whole self, which is what Jung was talking about. Carl Jung was talking about. And it's where I think it's the inevitable conclusion. If you play this whole personality type thing out, particularly when it comes to Myers-Briggs, if you take Myers-Briggs to its inevitable conclusion and you go through all of the different cycles, I think you inevitably end up at Carl Jung's work.
Yeah.
If you haven't ended up at Carl Jung's work, it means that you just kind of stalled out at an earlier level. You just kind of turned there, and that was as interested as you were, which is totally fine. But if you continue to leap the lily pads, I think all those roads of type end up at Carl Jung's door.
Yeah.
And Carl Jung discussed the vast importance of doing, integration work. And in his book, Psychological Types, in the book that introduced the foundational concept of cognitive functions that eventually evolved into the Myers-Briggs system with Isabel Briggs-Myers and Catherine Briggs, they based it off the work of that book. But the foundational elements of type were just represented in a single chapter of that book.
Yeah.
The rest of that book is talking about other aspects of psychology, which are the archetypes of what he called the archetypes of self, the 4 archetypes of self, which are persona, or how you interface with the outside world, like how you're going to show up, how you're going to present and represent yourself to other people. Ego, your relationship to yourself, what you know about yourself. You don't necessarily share everything with everybody else, but this is what you think and know about yourself. Your shadow, which is all your unconscious material, the stuff you don't know about yourself.
Yeah.
And then whole self, which is all of that and a bag of chips, right?
Yeah.
The whole thing. And when you do integration work, it means you have to, by definition, become interested in shadow work because that's the disowned parts. And in his opinion, anybody who does that work is actually giving a gift to the political and social sphere. And that was, in my opinion, that was one of the strongest motivators for me to stay apolitical. Because if I want to have my personal impact on politics, then it's not going to be in the political sphere. It's going to be in the individual sphere through integration.
Yeah.
And I think what I'm hearing you say is that this episode will fillet out what that all means.
Yeah. I mean, let's hope it does. I don't think we have to go too deep. I think we can hit some of these beats and give some context for this and help people understand maybe their role in it. So you mentioned these 4 parts that Jung talks about, and I want to zoom in. I think we assume that politics is all ego. Mm-hmm. And it's just ego, and clearly there's a lot of ego there. But the other day I made a X post where I just said we should stop calling politicians and start calling them persona-ticians, persona-ticians, because it feels like the political sphere is the battleground of the persona. That's what I perceive it to be. And if you look at politicians, I was just watching politicians recently, and I'm watching them, and they're so personaed, right? That you get a question from an audience member, or somebody asks you, or the journalist asks a question. They often don't even answer the question they're asked. They will take the question and then reframe it to something else and answer this kind of very sterile, appropriate, contained answer. Most politicians. There's a few that go off the rails very quickly, but most of them are personaed, and they answer something that's expected to be answered, and they keep it all polished and buttoned up. You never really get to see the real them. They never really answer your question. You
Stay on talking points.
Yeah, you never really get to see an authentic expression of this person. And we know that in Jungian concepts, the shadow and persona have a very close relationship with each other.
Right.
And the more curated your persona, well, usually that's an indication with the clients we work with in coaching and our programs. We know that a person that has a very curated, tight persona, and they have like one thing they show the world, they have a lot of shadow work, a ton of shadow work.
Yep.
So it feels like politics is the realm of persona, and it attracts people that have a ton of shadow material they're unwilling to deal with. Both the people that are the politicians putting themselves up and the people that are interested in politics directly themselves as well.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that people that are on their growth path and they're actually doing deep growth work, they usually don't have much interest in politics. They usually are kind of like, I'm doing my thing. I'm focused on the self. I'm only interested in like, if it's an actual policy or something that I care about topically that this interfaces with, but I don't just care about, quote, the subject of politics in a general way.
Yeah, I think there is a bit of that. I want to go back to when you said that there's a relationship between persona and shadow. I think we did episodes on this in the past,
Yeah.
the link between those two things and why an overly curated persona leads to more shadow content.
Yeah.
I think we did like an entire episode, at least one. And that was the thing that I was talking about and you were talking about for a while there. So I'm sure that there was like more than one episode we mentioned it. But just as a cliff notes, the reason why the more curated your persona, the bigger your shadow content is because we understand shadow work through triggers.
Yes.
We understand it through other people reflecting back to us information and content that we would not otherwise see on our own. But if our persona is overly curated, it means when somebody reflects something back to us, we don't take it seriously because we don't think they saw the real us anyway. So when we do get shadow material triggered, we don't take it seriously.
Yeah.
We don't go, oh, that's something I should contend with that. We just go, well, that person, they don't know what they're talking about because I'm not showing them the real me anyway. So that's why when your persona is too curated, your shadow material not only does it stay the same, but it also has an opportunity then to grow.
And the persona is what you show the world of yourself.
That's
if
right.
you don't know the definition of persona, that's just basically the interface. It's the quote unquote face we see of you.
Right. Yeah. Comes from the root word mask, which refers to masks on stage that amplify voices and amplify sort of facial expressions, not because they're fake, although they can be, but because they're amplified so everybody can see them. And so your persona and your shadow have that relationship to each other. And to go to your next point, which is that people who are super into politics tend to be personaed people. I don't know if I find that to be as true. I do find politicians to be very personaed. And then I would say anybody who uses politics as their identity.
Okay, maybe that's what I mean to say.
Right. So I think a person can be really into politics and be very interested in where the course of history is going right now. I tend to like things that are more core principles that are timeless. But this idea that politics is a fad, I don't think that necessarily means it's unimportant because, and it is faddish. It's like politics very much are memes and idea viruses and they have like a gajillion different nodes in the system for why they're emerging in the way that they are. So it's actually a fascinating study of culture and moments on the timeline and disruptive events and technologies and, just the development of humans. Like it's actually one of the most interesting sociological subjects, in my opinion.
Yeah.
If a person uses their political affiliation to define themselves, though, that is usually over personaed because you're using something that isn't an integrated self as your persona, as the thing that you're showing to the rest of the world. So then you run into that same problem as before, which is if somebody reflects back to you that a triggering or like you get something reflected back that's triggering to you. If you're defining yourself by your political, alignment or your political party, then they're not actually reflecting you back to you. You know that your entire mind knows that. And so you can disregard all of those moments of triggers. You can say that's more about my politics. And so unfortunately, if you turn politics into an identity, it means you're going to have the same problem. You're going to have a very large shadow because the content that is pointing your shadow back to you, you're not going to pay attention to.
Yeah.
So it's the same challenge. So I would say politicians and those who use politics as their identity, they are the ones who tend to have big shadows.
Well, and Carl Jung himself talked about these ideas.
Mm-hmm.
We're not just talking about this for the first time. I mean, Carl Jung, if you go back to some of his work, in fact, Antonia, I think you've got some things that you have to maybe even reference today. I don't know what context you want to bring that up in, but I know that, we're not inventing this idea that our shadow persona and the political sphere have a relationship with each other.
No, I actually think that it was his dharma too.
Yeah.
I think because he lived through World War I, he lived through World War II. He wrote most of his collective works. In fact, I think almost all of his collective works were written after World War II. Now, that doesn't mean everything he ever wrote. He wrote essays and papers and all that stuff. But anything that's in his collected works volume, I could be wrong on this one, but I'm fairly certain he wrote everything basically when he's like in his 70s and 80s. And he had seen just how terrible things could get. Now, after World War I, that was when he wrote most of his personal stuff.
Yeah.
Like that was when he went through his own psychological breakdown. It's when he ended up journaling all the black books that ended up becoming the Red Book. And so he has plenty to write about, but he was sort of, I think that was when he was refining his ideas, working with clients, writing papers, separating from Freud's work, like he was kind of finding himself after World War I.
Yeah.
After World War II, his theories were sound. He had done decades of client analysis. And it was a theme he wrote over and over and over again in his work. And so, yeah, I did mark something in one of his books that I want to read, which talks about the connection between doing your shadow work and how it plays out in the outside world. And I think, again, I believe that this was a major component to what he was introducing to the world, because he thought it was actually the solution to no longer having that kind of level of strife. The authoritarianism, the willingness to harm huge amounts of people, all of that stuff he believed could be solved through doing one's own shadow work.
This makes sense why, going through world wars, it makes sense why you'd write a lot about the politics or the political realm, because I personally define politics as, and I've read this before, so I don't think I'm the only one, but it's the art of compromise. And it should be a collaborative experience. It shouldn't be a combative experience. I think, unfortunately, the political sphere has become versus. It's like this versus this. But if it's done well, it should be, yeah, we have ideas that conflict, but our goal is to come to compromise for the betterment of the entire society. Like, that's the point. We're supposed to have differing opinions and then workshop those down to something that we can both agree upon, or all of us can agree upon, because there's more than just two sides that we can move forward with.
Yeah.
I think that's what it is. It's the art of compromise. But if you can't compromise, then you enter into direct conflict.
Yeah.
And that creates warfare.
Right.
And so countries that are at war with each other were unable to compromise in the political sphere.
Yeah.
They had to go to warfare and direct hostilities. And so Carl Jung, coming through this, it would make sense why he was very concerned about this idea, because he saw the end result of not being able to resolve your political differences.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting definition for politics, and one that's extremely timely, because that's what it feels that we're lacking, is an ability to compromise, almost as if compromise means losing a sense of self.
Yes.
Like, if I compromise in how things will, like policy will roll out, it means that I've somehow compromised who I am as a human being.
Yes. And my values and my convictions and my ethics.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
That all go along with that.
Well, and that's the danger of turning your politics into your identity, is that if diplomacy requires us and politics requires us to meet halfway, but meeting halfway means I'm losing who I am, then you're going to have a lot of incentive to fight tooth and nail and to try to get everything you want.
Well, and the somebody right now listening, and I don't care where you are on the political spectrum, especially if you're listening at the time of this recording, you're going to say, but you don't understand, Antonia.
That's right.
The other side is so fill in the blank, how horrible, awful, everything.
That's right.
That it isn't about compromise anymore. It's about winning over the unethical, terrible side over there.
That's right. It's all an existential threat.
Right. Which brings us back to shadow, meaning this goes back into, I have the inability to accept the shadow on that side, because really it's reflecting my own shadow, if I'm really being honest about it.
Right.
I can't accept it. So I have to defeat it, obfuscate it, overcome it, and pretend it doesn't exist. Because if that shadow can exist in this world, if half the population believes XYZ, they're going to reflect back to me the parts of myself I don't like to see. It cannot exist. It cannot coexist alongside of me.
Yeah.
It has to be eradicated or won out over. I think a lot of people have this position. And it doesn't matter what your political persuasion is. That's how a lot of people feel.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
politics is no longer about compromise. It's about defeat.
And so what if we change the conversation from politics is an art of compromise to politics is an art of acceptance? Not toleration, not tolerate, but accept, because when I accept the other side and the shadow, I realize I'm accepting myself too, because I have the same fill in the blanks of darkness inside of me.
Yeah. Well, and Jung said it actually is acceptance, but it goes the other way. It's not accept others to accept self. It's actually accept self to accept others.
There you go.
I'm going to, if you're okay with it, I wouldn't mind. I mean, I don't know how often I read on the podcast, but I want to read this excerpt in Jung's book, Psychology and Religion. I cannot remember which part of the collected works it is. I can't remember which volume it is. So my apologies for all of you Jungians who like to go to your collective
Someone
works.
in the comments, leave us a comment. Let us know which part of the collective works it is.
And we'll see them between all the salty comments that are letting us know that we're totally wrong about this and that the other side actually is pure evil.
Yeah, exactly. It'll be from both sides or all sides, I'm sure, from multiple perspectives. Multiple countries too, because this isn't just US centric.
The most dangerous thing to be is a centrist. We all know this because everybody hates you because you're not on there. If you're on the other side, they at least understand that. If you're on nobody's side, well then you're pure evil. So it's in the book Psychology and Religion, and I found it under the chapter called A Natural Symbol, and it's basically, I don't know, about midpoint towards the end. Jung says, we must still be exceedingly careful in order not to project our own shadows too shamelessly. We are still swamped with projected illusions. If you imagine someone who is brave enough to withdraw these projections or not to project things onto others, all and sundry, then you get an individual conscious of a pretty thick shadow. So when we stop projecting our stuff onto other people, we start to realize how large our shadow is because we can't just punt the ball, right? We can't just kick the can over to somebody else. We're like, oh, this is mine. Oh, there's a lot of stuff that's mine. Oh, this is really big. So you end up becoming aware of, a lot of material, or at least even if you don't know the individual material in there or the content, you at least know the terrain is large. Such a man has saddled himself with new problems and conflicts. He's become a serious problem to himself, as he is now unable to say that they do this or that. They are wrong, and they must be fought against. He lives in the house of self-collection. Such a man knows that whatever is wrong in the world is in himself. And if he only learns to deal with his own shadow, then he has done something real for the world. He has succeeded in removing an infinitesimal part, at least, of the unsolved, gigantic social problems of our day. These problems are unwieldy and poisoned by mutual projections. So we're all projecting on each other, which is adding sort of these veins of toxicity in all of the social climate. How can anyone see straight when he does not even see himself and that darkness which he himself carries unconsciously into all his dealings? So in Jung's opinion, the reason why we have so much toxin and poison in our social spheres is because we are mutually projecting like crazy, right? We're unwilling to bring the challenge in-house, to see our shadows, to understand that they are thick, right? Or large, the terrain is big, that maybe that's the area we should be focused on and, moving that content. I mean, really what shadow work is being aware of something and then moving it from the shadow or the unconscious into the ego or the consciousness. The second we start to own these parts, these disowned parts, now they're not shadow material anymore. Now they're not in our unconscious. Now they're in our conscious awareness and they now become part of ego.
Yeah.
But if we don't do that, if we keep mutually projecting our shit onto each other, well, then that's when we get these time periods of intensity, these time periods of, no, you can't be right even a little bit. Because if you're right even a little bit, that reflects back to me that I might be wrong a little bit, right? Like I have to contend with that. I have to bring that problem in-house. And his opinion was, well, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to bring it in-house. And the more you can accept these parts of yourself, what is called disowned parts in the shadow, the more you can accept these disowned parts, the more you can accept them when you see them around you because they're not triggering these autoresponders of emotional reactivity.
Yeah.
Right? You're not like in this constant reactionary mode. Now you're going like, okay, well, yeah, I probably have something around that. And I think I'll ruminate on that or I'll think about it. I mean, just the very idea of when somebody triggers you, you don't react. Like just that all by itself. You get triggered, somebody says something that you find offensive, or in the political sphere, something that you think is like, something that will ruin everything for everyone or whatever. Just not reacting, just taking a moment to go, I wonder why I want to react. I wonder what's going on inside of me. Taking a second to explore, to find out what of that thing is also represented and present in you. Already now you have about 1 billion less social media posts.
Yeah.
Because most of the social media posts I read, like it's very clearly reactionary shadow material, very obviously and clearly. people are not thinking at all. They're not taking a moment. They're not even taking a second to breathe before reacting and responding. And so what if we just did that? What if we just, like, anytime we got triggered, just chilled out for a second to try to figure out why? Already you have a very different social climate. And in politics, if everything the quote unquote other side gets you all riled up, then according to Jung, what inside of you is actually being mirrored back?
Yeah.
Like, what is the thing you're taking exception to that is actually inner work? And if we just paused to ask that question and did some rumination on it and figured that piece out, can you think of how much more sort of calm the whole culture system would be?
Yeah. Well, and I don't think it even has to be everybody. That's the other thing is, you're hearing this. I think the idea is that if everybody does the same thing, that can fix the world. And I don't know if that's ever going to be possible without force or, authoritarianism or something, like telling us all we have to do something, but that's just behavioral. That's not going to actually be a heart and mind. But I think there is a certain level of hearts and minds attuning to these kinds of things that does make a difference. I mean, who has the idea of a tipping point? Was it Simon Sinek, or I can't remember who came up with the idea of 17.5% of a population as a tipping point in enough people that change can happen. Right? I think he was the one that coined it. I think Malcolm Gladwell talks about it too.
Yeah.
In the book, The Tipping Point. I don't remember who invented the idea, but Malcolm Gladwell has a whole book about it. I think there's a core that you don't need everyone. You need just that's what leadership is, right? You need a few people to step up and say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to lead myself to look at my own shadow and overcome some of these things. I won't project in the political or social sphere. And I think that gives me hope, because that tells me that it is possible to make some change, but we all have to have individual responsibility as well. I think that's really what you're speaking to is, this isn't a policy. This isn't a social movement. This isn't a group you belong to. It's not some kind of a value take to a collective. It's not something that's going to be very publicly observed. Now, the results might be publicly observed. You probably won't get a lot of credit for it. You probably won't get a lot of credence. Other people won't be like, wow, good job. In fact, as you're doing the work, you might actually look really stupid and foolish in front of people and silly. Like there's not a lot of external benefits or rewards, at least initially. But, and the work's quiet and to yourself and internal and frustrating and slow and difficult. And it's like, well, who wants to sign up for that?
Right.
It'd be easier just to make a quick post on X and feel a little hit of dopamine, like, aha, I stuck it to that side over there, aha.
Right.
And feel good. And like, I don't want to do all that work to feel genuinely better and overcome those things.
Yeah.
Like, that's kind of my natural lazy streak. So it takes effort and pressure to go, no, I'm going to focus on this for myself.
Yeah.
I'm going to take control of my responses. I'm going to own them and be responsible for myself. And I'm not going to make it other people's problem. I'm not going to just project it onto others and say, it's your fault I'm this way. It's your fault I can't blah, blah, blah. It's your fault. It's like, okay, there might be external situations. And also, what can I bring in-house? What can I look at? And what do I have influence over as the node in a system of my life?
Yeah. Well, anything that is worth having usually is earned.
Yeah.
And we very rarely get things the easy way. Like if something just gave you a quick dopamine hit, it probably wasn't a hard thing that earned you something important. It was probably a cheap thing that got you a little sugar hit for your brain, and then you move on to the next thing. So when you talk about how difficult shadow work is, I mean, I would say the setup to shadow work, like the initial part, is pretty tough, because you have to go through a lot of ego thrashing. You have to do a lot of like, oh, I'm the asshole type of things, right? You have to go, oh, maybe it was me. Maybe it's been me the whole time.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, it just becomes like anything else. It's like, at a certain point, your body, if you've been to the gym enough, your body's like, oh, I want to keep going because that feels good, right? And so it's similar to that. But that said, I think it's really forces people to put, in my opinion, it's put your money where your mouth is. There is a lot of rhetoric in the world around being an ally and doing things for the greater good and being altruistic. And, like all of this, I'm really invested on all of this because I want a better place for my children. And I really believe that the other side is going to create a worse world. And so there's all this talk about how this behavior is altruistic, but political altruism starts with doing one's own shadow work. Like that's where it starts. You cannot be politically altruistic unless you're dealing with your own demons, because otherwise you're just projecting everything onto the other guy. And that's not going to end up creating good policy. It's going to end up creating reactionary policy that is designed as a coping mechanism. Like how much of this is just coping mechanism, particularly in politics, where we're trying to keep ourselves from seeing things that are very inconvenient.
Yeah.
So if a person says that they are responsible and altruistic in the socio-political realm, and they are reactionary, and every time, like they're always trying to, fight for whatever agenda they're aligned with, that's part of their identity. And they won't hear new information that comes in, or new data and research. They won't hear when the other side has a point, right, that they should be listening to, that they should be opening their mind to and reevaluating. When people refuse to do all of that, when they just, as soon as they see a particular political candidate, or when they hear a particular policy, or when, like anything that triggers, quote unquote, the other side, and they get all riled up, there is no altruism there. There's only a desire to escape one's own shadow content. In fact, I would say that it's incredibly selfish. It's basically a coping mechanism writ large.
Yeah.
So there is no altruism there. So to me, even though it is all the things you mentioned, which is hard and means we have to take responsibility, and there's a lot of stuff in there, I think that it's the actual money where your mouth is. If you believe you're a compassionate person of empathy and of true adult responsibility, this is where it starts. And if you can't get over it, if you can't get to a place where you're at least aware, I don't even think you have to do all your shadow work. I don't even think that's a thing. I don't think any human being can do all their shadow work.
Yeah.
But they need to be aware of it. They need to account for it. They need to pause before they attack. They need to not make assumptions that the other guy, whatever that means, is always wrong. And if you can just get those basics down, now you're qualified to actually have a real political conversation. But until you have those things, like it's just going to keep playing out over and over and over, because the specific politics of the day are incidental. This is an energetic cycle that happens in humans and has been for time immemorial. So you're just caught up in a cycle. You're just caught up in something that humans do and have been doing and have been doing for a long time. I mean, as far back as hitting the other guy on the head with a cudgel because he said something you didn't like, right? Or he's trying to take your stuff or whatever. Like this is ancient. And so being reactionary is very ancient. Using these kinds of things as your identity, right? And not questioning the self. This is all ancient stuff. So if we really want to ascend as people, if we actually are cycling up and spiraling up, if we are becoming smarter, we talked about at the beginning of this episode, a bunch of people are armchair psychologists. Why? Because this is a really powerful and important technology that came on the scene that humans can tell helps move us forward, right? Like as a species, we move forward when we understand basic psychological concepts. It's a very powerful technology. So we tend to spiral up in all of these different ways. But one of the ways that we struggle to get better is just contend with our own bullshit. Yeah. That's the thing that still keeps us anchored to ancient practices of beating each other up because we don't know any better. And so I think Jung's statements of even if it's infinitesimal, right? What do you say? Infinitesimally is moving towards, like less poison in the social and political sphere. Well, one person, it doesn't matter, but in aggregate, it does matter, right? And like you said, and maybe it's just a tipping point of leadership. Yeah. But and so we need to stop using political theater as our entertainment. Yeah. I think that's a big piece of it too, is not just allowing, because I mean that's a whole other subject, is that when we use stories and myths to understand shadow work, which is what we've been doing. Marie-Louise von Franz, who was a student of Carl Jung's and has written some fabulous books on Jungian psychology, particularly fairy tales. What was it? Something, The Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales. Mm-hmm. She very much talks about this. And what we've done is in apocryphal tales and in myths and in fairy tales, we play our shadow out because it's easier to understand it through entertainment, through these stories. But when we turn politics into entertainment, now we've turned it into a way for us to understand our shadows. And now we want our shadows to play out in it. Does that make sense? It's like we kind of hope it will, because then we can understand ourselves more through all of this theater.
Yeah.
The challenge is that politics isn't theater. Like, we turned it into that, but that's not what it is. It's governance. So if we turned something that's meant to create policies and governance rules that impact our day-to-day lives, if we've turned that into theater so that we can understand our shadows, but it's just real enough for us to attach to it, now we are like, it's almost like we're playing shadow games in politics all the time. And it's turned into a pretty toxic cycle.
Yeah. I think on a very personal level, one of the things I wish didn't happen to me in all of this. So we talked about all these changes and everything's become so political. The result in my life, in a very personal way, is I become extremely cynical. And I hate it. I used to have much more optimism and possibility thinking. When I saw something, I would give people the benefit of the doubt, no matter who they were. But now it's really, I mean, I fight it. I'm aware of it, but it is so hard not to see an event or something happen or somebody in leadership say something and I go, that's probably not true. Like, that's my first and I don't want to be like that, but my first instinct is to go, they're probably lying. It's probably not the full story. They're probably covering over something. They're probably manipulating me or us in the situation. There's no truth to this. There's no authenticity. They're in persona. I'm dismissive. I'm cynical. I feel bad about it. I don't like to engage with it. It feels horrible. And I'm guessing you watching or listening, I don't care what your political background is or what you care about, values and interests and the things you think are important. I would guess all of us don't want to be cynical about our lives. Like, we might have gotten addicted to being cynical, but I think a lot of people struggle with cynicism. And I think that's the thing that I want to get rid of. And I wish I could have a more hopeful, when I see somebody, I can go, that's a genuine person speaking from a genuine place about genuine topics to genuinely help people. And I just don't feel that way, almost never, for anyone. I don't care who they are. I might even align with their values and their ethics, but I'm like, I don't know. I'm still cynical.
Yeah.
And I just hate that. I hate being cynical.
I think we have conflated skepticism with cynicism.
Maybe.
I think we should be skeptical. I think some people think cynicism is the right response.
I don't want to be gullible. I don't want to just buy anything somebody says, or, the New York Times posted this, it must be true. I mean, clearly we know it's not half the time. Like, the media is just a big lying machine. All of the mainstream or corporate media, they're horrible. They're horrible, and they manipulate us all in all these different countries, right? And that's the nature of it. And we know that as humans now. We're all becoming aware of just how dark and manipulative they've all become. And that makes sense. They have to make money. That's their guiding star, right? They're not there to inform us or help us have a better society.
Right.
These corporations want to gather more resource. That's their driving goal. And so whatever gets them that, they're going to do.
Yep.
Even if it's not a direct resource grab, it's going to be something in that arena.
Well, and that's the challenge, I think, of being in the contemporary world, is that we recognize that we have access actually to, or what our friend Darren introduced, the concept of perfect information.
Yeah.
Which is, we have a glut of, just look at some of the current events of the day. We have the capacity to see these events from about, 400 different iPhone or like smartphone camera angles.
Yeah.
We never had that before. Like, we have the capacity to have so much stuff recorded at any given moment.
Within minutes of an event happening. On X, right?
That's right, within minutes. And so we're able to have practically perfect information. And so it makes it so it's hard to believe when any sort of media outlet is trying to paint it as a certain angle to fit their narrative. It's really easy to become quite cynical that everybody's just trying to fit all content and information into whatever their agenda is.
Yeah.
But you can see why agendas start to exist, because, like you said, they're a business and they're trying to make money. So they have a demographic that they're attempting to, to reach or to appeal to. And then on the other side, when it comes to social media, we have all these algorithms that are pulling us into algorithm holes, right? I'm starting to go, never watch a video on anything unless that's all I want to have fed to me for the next 30 days. Like,
oh, that looks interesting. Click, and that's all you see for like
yeah,
the rest of your life.
That's all I get forever. And if I accidentally find something else interesting, okay, now I'm stuck here. This is all YouTube knows about me. And so I've started opening things in incognito windows just so that YouTube is not like pulling me into the algorithm of like, I'm like, oh, that's a really interesting eye makeup technique. And I'm like, no, I do not want exclusively eye makeup techniques for like the next, 10 years of my life, YouTube. So I'm like, oh, I guess I'll have to open that one in an incognito window and hide that from the algorithm. And
that's on a laptop. Most people are on a phone. They can't do that.
Exactly. Oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. Well, that's one of the advantages.
They're in an app, right?
Yeah, being a Gen Xer that's still on my laptop for the most part. So we get pulled into these algorithm death spirals, and we have mainstream media trying to appeal to their audience. We also, I can tell, there's a lot of media that believes that they are the kingmakers themselves, and so it's not just about money for them; it's also about power and influence, and so it makes it very difficult to know who to believe, and like you said, it's easy to get very cynical.
Yeah.
At the same time,
and we're told by that same media not to believe the literal things we're seeing.
Right.
Right. They're like, don't believe your eyes.
That's right.
These are not the droids you were looking for.
These are not the droids you're looking for.
Pretend like what you're looking at is actually a different narrative for the thing. And it's like, wait, what?
Yeah.
That's really scary.
So to go back to the point of origin of the purpose of this particular topic is I actually find that the more I'm doing my own shadow work, the more I feel comfortable and confident when I receive other people's information.
Yeah.
That I'm not going to get triggered by it. I'm not going to get reactionary. And because I'm in a calmer state, right? And I'm not like, how dare they or whatever, right? How could they? I need to go tell them what I think about that because my comment is like super duper important in the ripple of the ocean. If I'm not in that space, then I can look at it with a little bit more of an authentically skeptical tone, but not a cynical tone, because I'm already seeing where the person, I can kind of see the angle that it's coming from, and it doesn't offend me. Like I don't care what angle a person's coming from. It's okay, right? Like everybody's doing what they're doing. And the only way I think we can get to a point where we're accepting how other people are doing things is accepting ourselves, right? Like not having disowned parts of the self. It goes back to that quote I think I've said multiple times on the podcast about there being a quality of stillness in a person who does this kind of work.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing in themselves that they've rejected. So there's nothing that you can reflect to them that they'll reject. They're not going to reject anything in you because they reject nothing in the self. And that creates a stillness. So no matter what content is presented to a person like that, they're going to stay still because they're not going to reject anything. And like you said, the antithesis to rejection is acceptance, right? Not rejecting means accepting. Once you start accepting everything inside of yourself, you're going to start accepting things around you.
Yeah.
Now, acceptance doesn't mean condoning. It doesn't mean agreeing. It doesn't mean, allowing, nurturing
or amplifying
or allowing terrible things to happen. Accepting what is doesn't mean that you allow that thing to continue on if it's not healthy, but you're not triggered by its existence. You understand that you can do nothing about the fact that it just is. It's just reality. It just is. This is what is happening. And the more we're in a fantasy of believing that our disapproval will somehow change that thing to be different than what it is, like that's fantasy thinking. So it's in the same way with ourselves. It's like, if I just ignore all the stuff I don't like about myself, maybe it'll go away. It's like, no, it actually gets bigger. That's the wrong way to go about it.
Yeah.
And so once you start accepting things in the self, not condoning them, not continuing them, not allowing them to fester, right? Attempting to ameliorate. But how do you know how to improve something if you don't know what your actual starting point is? If you don't know what your you are here dot is? So acceptance just goes, this is my you are here dot. This is actually what's happening right now. And if I don't have to reject that, if I don't feel like some sort of, ethical reason to reject it and to go into some sort of disapproval spiral, right, and let everybody know how salty I am about all of it, then I can actually work with what it is, right? I can work and not be entering that space with a fantasy in my mind, but entering it with an acceptance of reality. And then from that point on, once you're in a space of acceptance, now you can compromise. Now you can meet halfway. And you can also understand, number one, when people have a point, because it doesn't matter what your political persuasion is. The other side actually is right about a bunch of stuff.
The other sides, by the way, it's not just, there's not just two sides anywhere in the world. There's multiple opinions and perspectives.
That's right. Exactly. And the other sides, but oftentimes we go pretty binary and go, well, there's a particular other side, right, that I don't like.
Sure.
But whatever it is, there's a bunch of stuff they're right about and you're wrong about.
Yeah.
Like a ton. And vice versa. There's a bunch of stuff you're right about that they're wrong about. So the first thing is, if you stop getting these autoresponder knee-jerk responses, the first thing you can do is listen to when they're right and include it in how you're seeing things. And now you're even more right. You're less wrong all the time because you're including the things that before you wouldn't dare to acknowledge might have some truth to them. And so you just become a smarter person. And then the second thing is that you problem solve more effectively because you're working with more tools. You don't have to turn a blind eye to something because it might go against something inside of yourself. You allow for that. Like you allow for yourself to be wrong in order for the problems or the solution to be right. And so you just have so much more to work with. And I think, like you said, politics, I love that. I'm immediately adopting it. Politics being the art of compromise. Now you can compromise in all the best ways. You don't have to think in terms of defeat and existential crisis and everything is that the other guy wants to do is always wrong. You can think in terms of, okay, so what's the best middle ground?
I like how you mentioned this idea of working toward the solution, because that is collaborative and cooperative. And often when you look at a political discourse and there's we have to defeat the other side energy, or we have to win this. I mean, typically there's like running for elections and winning, but I'm talking about the arena of ideas or policy, because that's where you need to collaborate toward an end. I think people took the focus off of what we're trying to accomplish. Like, we're trying to produce this thing out here and find the best solution for it. It's my idea has to win is now what it's become. And you can see that we're in a spirit of like competition and not collaboration, because I think even inside of coalitions, they're starting to break apart and war with themselves. Like, even they're having a hard time inside of these, like, let's say political parties or coalitions, they're having a hard time compromising and coming to agreement as well. They're also now like breaking apart and fighting each other in a lot of ways. And I think that's where it's almost like a trajectory you're on as a society.
Yeah.
You're either compromising toward an end goal, or you are fighting and you're, conflicting over things. I think here in the United States, I always just see this as a very basic way of when there was a goal of expansion west, the whole country had something to attune to. And so compromise seemed to be more on the table because the goal was to settle the entire continent. Well, once, hundreds of years later, the continent's settled, quote unquote. Like, there's no new territory to go towards. So now it's just we're fighting over the beans that have already been collected in a way.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes it's just and I think this John F. Kennedy kind of had an idea in the 1960s to try to refocus the United States, as an example, toward a common goal of going to space, going to the moon, trying to have a frontier to focus on, because then there's a goal out there. And maybe people now are hoping to do it around climate change, but that's so politically divisive that it doesn't really get everybody on the same goal. Again, that's still a little bean counting on what's here, not towards something new.
Yeah.
So I think in a lot of ways, that's what causes that. It's just the natural order of a society that's been built out. It's going to war with itself because there's no new expansion. There's no new purpose on the horizon. So I think that's just inevitable altogether.
Yeah.
Do you have a comment on that specifically?
Or a common enemy.
Or a common enemy.
Yeah.
Yeah. But even a common enemy that's more defensive. That's less about, unless you're taking over their land, I guess.
Yeah.
Like, that's less progressive and expansive and on a horizon, right?
Yeah, it makes me think of tribal leadership. We did a podcast about it a long time ago. But Dave Logan, and I don't remember who the other writers were. I'm sorry. I always just remember Dave Logan because he came to our TEDx event a million years ago. Or no, yeah, it was Dave Logan. Anyway, so he has that concept of tribal leadership and how there's like the different levels of where tribes like sort of cling together. And you can go listen to that podcast episode. I think it's called Tribal Leadership. But there's a certain level where people gather together and get close to each other when they have a common enemy. But the most ascended level of a tribe is when they stop fighting against an enemy and start going towards a higher purpose together.
Yes.
Right. Like he was talking about DreamWorks or one of those animation studios. And they were interviewing these companies that had like a really good culture. And generally the culture was at what they call tribal level 5.
It's Pixar, I think.
Oh, was it Pixar? It was one of those two. And they asked, who is your enemy? Right. Like
who's your competition?
Who's your competition?
Your main competition. What do you guys consider your main competition at Pixar, for example?
Yeah. And at the time the guy was like, hair? Because hair was just really hard to animate.
Yeah.
And so he didn't even understand the question. It was like, what do you mean who's our competition? It must be hair.
It's the problem to solve is the competitive thing.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And so I think that's what you're talking about, is that when we're really aligned and heading towards something that is a higher, sort of like a higher goal of achievement.
Yeah.
Then we don't even actually have to have a common enemy.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's kind of land this a little bit more practically here as we wrap this up, because I think these are, we talked in a general principled way. We're not mapping this to specific personality types, but I guess the political sphere is a great place to work on your shadow as a person, because there's going to be endless opportunities to be triggered there. And we talked about in the shadow episodes before, anything we've talked about around the shadow, we say triggers are good. Those are fantastic. If you're getting triggered, that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. That means that you now know what shadow material you need to bring into conscious awareness.
Yep.
It's because it's somebody said something or did something that made you feel like, you othered them. And you basically said, that's not me. I do not associate with whatever that thing is that made something trigger inside of me. I'm going to distance myself from it. What's really happening there is you are now distancing yourself from yourself. Like you're distancing a part of you. You're taking it fishing. You're going to put it out to the back 40 on the acreage of the property of your life, right? Weird metaphors, analogies. I don't know. I try to struggle with any of it all. But the point is you're othering yourself, honestly.
Yeah.
It's a part of you this person is reflecting. And to say, okay, where in me does that live? Because I'm very triggered by this.
Yep.
So I think the political sphere is a fantastic place to work on yourself. If you can hang there, it's got a lot of material, I think, for all of us that's like, what? The person said what? Get ready to post something on social media and be like, okay, what am I doing here? Why do I care about this? Why am I writing this and being so hostile or upset about this? What does that say about me? Maybe that's the first step that someone can do. If you're listening or watching right now, if you get triggered, it's to say, okay, what does this trigger say about what I'm dealing with in myself?
Yep. Well, and just as a note, it doesn't sound like we talked much about personality type, but in psychological types, when Jung is talking about personality, he's not talking about Myers-Briggs types, obviously, because that hadn't been invented yet. They would invent it later based on that book.
Yeah.
He's talking about personality in terms of our psychological cognition, but also our persona, our ego, our shadow, and our whole self. Those are the 4 archetypes of personality. So we are talking about personality, just not personality type.
Exactly.
And personality encompasses more than just type. It encompasses all of these components. And a big component is shadow. That's a big part of our psychological makeup. And so when we talk about personality and shadow and politics, we are talking about the darkest, murkiest part of our actual personality. It's just all the stuff we're disowning.
Yeah.
And that stuff plays out in the political and the social sphere. That's where we see the dance happen in front of us. And so, like you said, politics is a fabulous place to do this. Any sort of organized paradigmatic collection like religion is also a fantastic place to do this. And I would argue that politics have started to remind me of religion quite a bit.
Of course.
Yeah. When you're talking about like even within these demographics, there's infighting. The first thing that comes to my mind is like Baptist churches of our youth, that there'd be a Brethren Baptist on one side of the road and a Brethren Baptist on the other side of the road. And you're like, what's the difference between those two churches? It's like, well, they think it's important to baptize backwards and they think it's important to baptize forward. And so it's like, you have to have 2 churches for that. And they're like, oh no, there's this huge meltdown. There was like this major problem. And then they ended up splitting into 2 different factions. It's like, I'm starting to see this in the political sphere in the same way that we saw it in the religious sphere decades past.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that politics is an opportunity to get triggered and to look at our shadow. And then I think a collaborative frame is the next thing to maybe weave into our experience, to say like a quick check and just say, am I in competitive frame right now or collaborative frame? That's the other real practical thing I think you could take away from this podcast.
Yep.
So triggers are good. They point to our shadow. And then you could say, am I competitive or collaborative? That's another question I could say, would come up for me. What are some other practical things, Antonia, from your perspective that you maybe yourself are associated with when you're looking at the political world, or you would give advice to somebody else that maybe is, because at the time of this recording, we're getting ready to go into probably one of the most intense political time periods of our lifetime, potentially. I mean, that's what I'm projecting.
In the country that we live in, yes.
In the United States. And I would say it affects the rest of the world. It doesn't really even matter if it's just United States policies or politics.
Yeah.
The globe is attuned to this right now.
I would agree. Yeah.
And so again, I don't know how well what I just said will age to the future. Who knows what happens? And I want this to be a very principle-based podcast, no matter what time you're listening to it.
Yeah.
But at the time of this recording, a lot of stuff's going down.
Yeah, it's intense stuff. So I think there's a couple powerful shadow questions that I ask myself on a pretty regular basis. Whether or not they have the desired results, that varies. But sometimes it's actually pretty beneficial. The first one is one of my favorite questions to ask myself on a daily basis is, what am I lying to myself about? Like especially if I'm heated, I'm upset, things, like I'm all salty about something.
Yeah.
As quickly as I can, I try to go, okay, what am I lying to myself about? Because as soon as I have clarity, even if the clarity doesn't work in my favor, I almost always diffuse my tension because I can see what's going on, and my job is to accept reality as it is. So as soon as I answer the question of what am I lying to myself about accurately, I usually find my emotions diffuse, and I'm no longer upset or salty. I'm just looking at reality and going, okay, how do I work with this? And the second question is, what am I disowning in myself? Like, what part of myself am I refusing to look at? Because it is a part of me waiting to see it. And the more disowned parts I have, the more they're trying to get my attention in the most obnoxious ways possible. Like, they might encourage me to do things that are against my values. They might encourage me to do things that are harmful to other people. These disowned parts will get my attention one way or the other. And I can either do it through actual, acknowledging, accepting, and integration work, which is not easy, but it has so much less fallout, right? like it's not like it's not a situation that's forcing me to integrate a part of myself because now I've done a terrible thing and I have to own it, right? So the implications are a lot more calm. And so those two practices for myself, what am I lying to myself about? And what in myself am I disowning?
I think if you don't ask yourself those questions, it seems to be the source of a lot of physical, emotional, and mental health issues. Mm-hmm. Not all. I mean, seriously, there's chemical imbalances. There's actual physical things going on.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of things that we do have more in our control or influence around mental health, emotional health, and even physical health.
Yep.
And if we start with the mental health aspect of it, I think that a lot of our mental health issues, not all of them again, but a substantial amount come from disowning parts of ourselves and not asking, what are we lying to ourselves about? And then building a house of cards around our persona, rejecting the ego. And now it comes out in like weird, I'll use in air quotes, disorders. Non-normative behaviors, non-normative things that we have to contend with and struggle through. And I think people know what I'm talking about.
I don't think you have to tiptoe around that. Somebody might get salty and say, no, it's not my fault. It's something else. But I would say that most of psychology is trying to bring the mind whole.
Yeah.
Trying to bring the self whole. Yeah. And disorders are generally based on complexes that are based on, or like coping disorders based on complexes, based on gripped complexes that are disowned parts. That's basically most of what therapy is.
Yeah.
Or really should be.
Yeah.
So I don't think you have to worry that somebody's going to be like, well, no, my health issues are 100% different. It's fine. That's fine. But a lot of health issues can be at least addressed through proper psychological hygiene.
Yeah.
And mental hygiene happens through mental hygiene, right? And so, I think that's generally the algorithm.
And then the final thing I'll just say is, and then we can wrap up, I believe that shadow work is involved and associated with spirituality. Mm-hmm. And I think that if we reject shadow work, we're rejecting our spiritual sense of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I'm not talking about religion, I'm talking about a sense of something that's bigger than us, a spirituality it's a transcendent viewpoint or a transcendent experience of some sort. That's how I'm defining spirituality here. And I think we cut ourselves off from magical, transcendent moments and experiences if we don't go through this work and look at our shadow. So at first it's going to be tough. We have to get triggered. We've got to look at material. We've got to be honest with ourselves. We have to do the work when other people aren't. And it seems very unfair. Like I'm working on myself and that other person over there isn't, and they're still projecting onto me, and they're blah, blah, blah. You have all this like frustration that it feels so unfair. Well, why should I have to do that if no one else is going to do it?
Yep.
Right. But it does start to change you, and you do have a sense of self, and they change. It may not get quote unquote better in the way you define better, but it does get different. And I would just argue that you shift the way that you approach life. And I do think life gets better ultimately in a long enough timeline, a big enough framework. And then I think what happens is it opens you up for spiritual experiences, transcendent experiences, which opens you up to wisdom, like taking knowledge into wisdom. Now you have wisdom because you understand more about who you are and about what triggers you and the darkness and maybe the shadow. And by the way, all shadow isn't dark. Some of it's just unconscious. Some of it's really good parts of you that you're not looking at either, like amazing talents. You know, you're a shadow artist, maybe like doing something that's just ancillary to the thing you should be doing in your life because you can't see it because it's in your shadow of the thing that you're here to do, the purpose, passion, and mission of your life. Well, again, that might live in the spiritual realm in your shadow. You need to see. So this isn't necessarily bad stuff all the way down. There's good stuff in here too to look at the shadow. And I think it opens us up for those. So if you feel like something's missing on a very deep, spiritual, energetic, higher purpose level, it probably has to do with some of these levers. It probably means that you could look at your shadow more, and you could work on yourself in these ways to open some of those energies up and see some of those possibilities in front of you.
Yeah. To go back to your point of why should I have to do this if nobody else is, or it doesn't seem anybody else is, and it's hard, and like what's my incentive? A while back, and I'm sure I've mentioned this on the podcast before. Unfortunately, I say things in so many different places. I never know what I say where. So, stop me.
Repetition is fine.
Stop me if you've heard it.
Have you heard like how many stories have you heard from like Tony Robbins tells the same story over and over and over again, or other people tell the same story, like
fair enough.
Writers and speakers and podcasters, like
yeah.
Richard Branson, man, he tells the same freaking stories over and over and over.
Okay.
You're fine.
Okay. I'll just tell
You're just
the
getting
same thing
old.
over.
That's fine.
I'm just getting old, right? Like
That's
my
what
dad.
old people do.
Definitely heard the same story from my dad 4 billion times. So, okay, fair enough. Just becoming my father. So at a certain point, I realized I was like, well, I'm the only person that was there when I was born that's going to be there with me when I die. Like all those people that were there when I was born, none of them will be with me throughout the entire journey. And really special, important people have come into my life, and some have left. And I'll have really special, amazing people enter my life in the future. And so it's not like I'm going to have been alone, but from beginning, from A to Z, from cradle to grave, right? From womb to tomb, it's just basically been me as the one constant. If I'm going to be my travel buddy through time, if I'm going to be like my most constant backpacking buddy through this entire timeline of existence that I get, wouldn't I want to know who that person is? Like, wouldn't I want to get to know them and like them and accept them and learn to enjoy their company? like if I'm the one person, right? Like, isn't it kind of, isn't it a little masochistic if I don't do that?
Yeah.
And one of the best ways to like myself is to accept myself. And one of the best ways to accept myself is to accept all the parts of myself that are trying to get my attention and might encourage me to take actions that aren't the best actions to take. And when I do that, I like myself less, right? When I take actions that are inconsistent with how my ego sees itself, I take a self-approval hit. I like myself less. But if I can see these parts of my shadow and integrate them, if I can know who and what they are, and I can accept all these disowned parts, well, now I have nothing to reject. Now I get to just like this person. And so while it's not easy work, it's pretty straightforward work.
Yeah.
Right? It's not easy, but it is straightforward. And it comes with a massive benefit of self-acceptance, self-love, self-approval, right? Like I get to hang out with this person my entire life. And I'm so glad that was the person that I hung out with the entire time. It was me. And it was, and aren't I lucky?
Yeah.
Right. Aren't I lucky that I'm the person I get to spend as my number one constant companion through this life cycle? And I think shadow work, or at least doing this Jungian whole self work, I cannot think of a more, and like you said, a spiritual way of experiencing that. So it's hard, but I think that the benefits are difficult to explain. They're difficult to describe. And then the other added benefit is that I don't look like an asshole online defending politics because I'm not thinking, right?
Yeah.
The other benefit is that I also have a pretty good reputation, right? That I'm not just in an autoresponder mode of getting salty over, political conversation. So
yeah. So you might be listening or watching right now and going, I don't agree with you guys.
I assume everybody is.
I think that there is room for all the things that you're kind of rejecting and saying that shadow work is the way to go. And I would say to you that you're right. If that's how you feel, you're right. What we're talking about isn't actually going to be for everybody at the timeline that everybody might be on right now. There is a time period in your life when you do need to take the political sphere more seriously and be more in persona. And I think it's a natural timeline maturation process.
Yeah.
It's appropriate at some point to take it as the most serious thing ever. And it all matters 100%. And it actually is it's like the end all be all. There's a moment, like all of us have to go through that. I think that's a natural thing that we need to experience. And so if you are rejecting some of this shadow idea of getting triggered and working on that, I would say that's good. Please reject it and go do what you need to do, because you need to be ready for this work. You have to have gone through kind of the other parts and get your sea legs. You can't just skip from childhood directly to shadow work, right? You have to have some kind of embodiment of the persona to be able to get to this place. And I would say if you are resonating with what we're saying, we'd love to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. Leave a comment, ask a question. More importantly, share your story. Maybe you've been very politically minded in the past and you realized, that's not serving me. Or maybe you ameliorated in a unique way that we'd love to hear about. Like maybe you actually had a perspective shift. So you didn't reject maybe some of the things you used to care about, but you definitely integrated more than just those perspectives. And that's really an interesting story, right? It's not just about fully rejecting, it's about transcending and integrating what we've come through.
Oh, yeah. I love it when people are political, but have done some of this work.
Yeah.
They're usually really fascinating people.
Yeah.
Yeah. They have very interesting ideas.
Well, and they're usually not politically binary anymore. They're usually open to a broader perspective, typically outside of the political sphere. But even inside of it, I think there's a lot of opening to those perspectives. So we want to hear from you. Come over to Personality Hacker and make your voice heard.
Yeah. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on various platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. There's a bunch of different places. And if you enjoy the podcast, you can leave us a rating and review on iTunes and other places. And you might be watching us right now on YouTube because we have a video podcast. If you haven't, if you're just an audio podcast listener, you should come check out the video podcast, see if you like it. Sometimes it's interesting to just put faces to voices. And if you are on YouTube, you can subscribe, and hit the bell to let you know when future episodes come out. And as far as this concept of shadow work, right, really sort of understanding the whole enchilada of who you are, this is a major focus of our Personality Life Path program, is to understand your relationship to your ego and to your shadow. And we do it through Jungian cognitive functions, meaning that we go through all 8 of the functions and we organize it by Dr. John Beebe's archetypal energies. Really, the goal, though, is to understand as much of the whole self as you can do in an 8-week virtual program that culminates in a 3-day live event. I've heard from a lot of people that it's a total game changer, and it's one of our favorite programs to do because we always learn something from it as well. So if all of this sounds right, if it sounds like, actually, this is the time for me to understand all of these aspects of who I am, go to personalityhacker.com and look up the Personality Life Path program and find out which one is coming up next, because there is enrollment periods that are happening at certain time periods of the year.
Yeah.
Find out which one's next and see if this is a good program for you.
I can't echo your recommendation of Personality Life Path enough, Antonia. I think it is a world-class program. I think it's becoming our life work. We've had just in a very short period of time, almost 100 people go through it. And I would say a large percent of those people have said this has actually changed their life, not just it changed my life in a theoretical way. Like jobs have been changed, relationships, career paths, dharmas have been found, like life purposes have been found, huge shifts in what people are doing now versus when they started.
Yeah.
And it happens very quickly for a lot of folks.
I actually think we're over 100 at this point.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So I hope it's in the millions at, some very future date. I would love, this is, again, I think a very important work, and I think people's lives are definitely shifted. Can't encourage it enough. Anyway, we need to sign off about this. Love to hear from you. Come over to personhacker.com and check out all those programs, but also come and make your voice heard. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.